Hey class, so I'm going to briefly share my exegesis paper of 1 Corinthians 7, 1 through 7. So reading from the ESV, this passage is, "Now for the matters you wrote about, quote, it is good for man not to have sexual relations with a woman, unquote. But since sexual immorality is occurring, each man should have sexual relations with his own wife, and each woman with her own husband. The husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife, and likewise the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but yields it to her husband. In the same way, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but yields it to his wife. Do not deprive each other, except perhaps by mutual consent, and for a time, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer. Then come back together again, so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. I say this as a concession, not as a command. I wish that all of you were as I am, but each of you has your own gift from God. One has this gift, another has that." Now, a first read of this passage might indicate that Paul sees himself, as well as anybody who is a celibate person, as somebody who is above people who are married. And I've used this argument, and others have used this argument to say that Paul doesn't have everything right. Well, when you do a proper exegesis of the passage, it's revealed both through the historical context as well as the context of reading the passage that Paul was saying just the opposite. Let me show you the historical context to get started. So 1 Corinthians is a book of the Bible that is an epistle. And as we know, the epistles were letters that were written by apostles. Paul is the apostle who is the writer of this epistle, and he's writing this as what they believe to be the second letter to the Corinthians. So Paul addresses quite a few sins in earlier parts of 1 Corinthians, including adultery, sexual immorality, sacrificing of idols, prostitution, because these were things that were commonplace within the Corinthian culture. See, Corinth was a city that is a port city on the south side of Greece, making it rife for a bunch of young men, namely sailors, who are engaging in trade in this area to, well, engage in those sorts of behaviors. So in the passages that precede 1 Corinthians 7, we can see that Paul is clearly warning them about sexual misconduct. In the passages of 1 through 7, Paul is talking about how to behave sexually, and afterwards he's dealing with particular exceptions, such as what to do if you're widowed, what to do if you're married to a non-Christian who wants to leave, a non-Christian who wants to stay. So everything about this passage is having to do with sexual problems with that the Corinthians have. Okay, so let's move directly into the exegesis. Now, for the matters you wrote about, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. Now, what's interesting about this particular passage is that verse 1b, which I'm starting with the quotations, is in quotations because it is believed that Paul is actually quoting the letter that was written to him by the Corinthians. People in Corinth who were in this Grecian society were growing up around the characters of like Aristotle and Socrates and all these great philosophers who were celibate. And the thought of this was that as a celibate person, you can dedicate more time to philosophical seekings and understandings and being even more strong, and being stronger religiously. So the viewpoint is not being celibate allows me to dedicate more time to God per se. It was the essence, the spirit of that is being celibate makes me better than people who are not celibate. And Paul has to address this situation. But because of the temptation to sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife and each woman her own husband. The husband should give his wife her conjugal rights and likewise the wife to her husband. What Paul is dealing with is he's noting this historical context around him, like, okay, Corinth is a city full of sexual sins, and you're talking about all of you guys being celibate, all of you guys wanting to be celibate so you can raise yourself above others. What those kinds of things tended to lead to, by the way, when people would separate based off of certain sexual behaviors or how these separations were divisive enough to cause a break in the church. So all the celibate Christians would go and start their own church and be this holier than thou church, supposedly. And the key word in the passage is each. It's used in the terms of each man, each woman, as in every single one of you, and that's what he's implying, is every single one of you have to get married. So the second point is Paul teaching specifically on the value of having sex with your spouse. It reads, "For the wife does not have authority over her own body." So verses 4 through 5 read, "For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Do not deprive one another, except perhaps by agreement for a limited time, that you may devote yourselves to prayer. But then come back together again, so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control." It's important to point out that when Paul is using the term body, he's using it in the term of their sexual body. So the sexual nature of a husband or the sexual nature of a spouse. Those are the things that are owned by the other person. And Paul is teaching this to prevent them from getting into temptation. Again, they're in this context of a city that is rife with all kinds of sexual immorality. So the reason Paul is teaching this is as a safety measure and instructions on how to not fall into sexual malpractice. So he's not in the mind of dealing with, oh, how great being celibate is right now. He's in the mind of dealing, okay, these people are really messed up. I just need to give them some direct instruction right now. And this is the instruction, and here's what you just need to do. You need to get married, constantly be having sex with that person, and devote yourself to prayer if when and necessary, and then get right back to it, because you guys just cannot handle the freedoms of living in a city like this and retaining your holiness. So Paul is completely concerned with how the Corinthians are going to behave. They talk this big celibate talk, but he doesn't really believe that they can walk the big walk. In this passage, Satan could mean one of two things, by the way. It could have meant that he was talking about the actual devil, but what's most likely the case is he was talking about satanic-minded people. So the people of Corinth who would be tempting them is probably who he's talking about here. So the literal sexual temptation of others around them is what he's trying to prevent them from getting into. So then we get into the big, why is Paul saying these things to the Corinthians? After all, they're Christians. Maybe they live in this country, but why in the world could they not be celibate if they wanted to? Shouldn't they be able to set their minds and make that decision for themselves? Well, here's what Paul says about that. In verses 6 through 7, he says, "Now as a concession, not a command, I say this. I wish all were as I myself am, but each has his own gift from God, one of a kind and one of another." What's interesting about this term gift that he's using is, in all likelihood, he's talking not about like spiritual gifts or the gift of celibacy, in fact, but he's talking about his gift of vocation, his gift of charism, his gift of being an apostle. This particular gift sets him apart for being a celibate individual. Other gifts that these people can have who are not apostles do not have this weight of celibacy on them, and he's telling them to stop worrying about trying to be celibate, stop worrying about trying to one-up each other, and just concentrate on keeping yourself away from sin. This is something, in other words, he's saying, this is something that I can handle, and it's something that you cannot handle. So don't even bother trying. You are not an apostle like me. He's saying he wishes that they could all be, but it's not really counted against them at all. And that's not, and his effort isn't to count it against him. His effort is to set himself apart from everybody in the room. So what in essence is Paul talking about? In my reading of this, I believe what he is talking about is this desire for Christians to outpace one another. They're aiming for prestige. So he's talking about people who are going for prestigious titles within the church or within life so that they can brag about them, so that they can feel bigger than somebody else. For people who God hasn't called to get, say, like their doctorate, and they're aiming to get it because it makes them feel good about themselves. It makes them feel better than others. he's speaking against this spirit of competition within the body that divides the body being the church. So the lesson that we can take, that we can learn from this passage, is whatever it is that we are aiming to do, it better be because God has given us the gifts to do it, and because God has ordained for us to do it. And it's not very easy for us to tell each other and to judge one another along those lines, but God has set people apart for purposes, and the purposes weren't to glorify themselves, but to bring glory to Him. And Paul's aim is to do the same thing with these people in dealing with this issue. His aim is to take the people who are trying to elevate themselves and reminding them to stay humble, and in turn reminding us to stay humble. These aren't gifts that we earned, but these are gifts that God freely gave to us, and we better use them for His purposes. I hope you guys enjoyed the presentation. If you have any questions, leave them in that comment section, and I'll do my best at answering them. I'm pretty good at that, I hope. Have a great rest of the day. Thanks for being in class with me.